Okay, I'm here with Nathan from Digital Gnosis. I saw his channel recently when he had a discussion with John Vervaeke, which I always follow. I think Vervaeke is a genius personally, so I'm keen to follow his discussions. And you find a lot of really interesting people if you do that. But in any case, I'd like to ask Nathan where he's coming from. As I understand it, he was a Christian for a time and then deconverted, and now he talks with Christians from time to time and addresses like apologetics arguments and stuff like that. He is just wrapping up a master's in philosophy and is going into a PhD program, right?
I just quit the PhD actually because I'm going to go back into industry to do software. But so yeah, I'm not no longer. I was a PhD student for a day, I think, and then decided it made better sense financially to go back into industry.
Yeah, no question about that. So good luck on that. But what got you into philosophy in the first place? Like, was this through high school? Did you have a bachelor's in philosophy, or how'd that go for you?
Yeah, I didn't have a bachelor's in philosophy. My undergraduate degree is in software engineering, actually, and I did a degree apprenticeship. So that meant I was working at a yeah. If you need to deal with that, don't worry. Um, yeah, so that meant I was working 4 days a week at a defense company for 4 years, and then on day release, I was going to university to do this degree. Um, in that time was when I sort of came across Jordan Peterson, and I think his ideas, particularly his biblical series of lectures that he was doing, um, sort of pushed me toward organized religion. I think but prior to that, I didn't have I mean, I probably had more informed views than the average person because in the UK, at least, I think most people just don't really care about religion or philosophy all that much. But I don't think I had particularly well developed views prior to that. I didn't do philosophy in sixth form, which is our like high school before university. I did all sciences and maths. I mean, I'd certainly had an interest in those sorts of questions. I did like a short course in religious studies and stuff, and I suppose broadly interested in philosophical questions um, for a long time. As I think kind of many people are as they develop, right? They start thinking about how it is that words work or thoughts, or could my red be someone else's red, or is there like a different vowel sound that isn't a part of our language, and what would that be like to hear, or a different color we can't see? Um, and so I had those kinds of thoughts, but yeah, prior I think it was really when I was around like 19 or so years old and really got into Peterson stuff that the idea of actually studying religion or becoming a religious person really opened up to me. uh no, I think there are a few things that go into that as well. I mean, primarily trauma, right? Because I'm someone who's adopted, and I struggled with depression. And so being adopted is a large part of why I struggle with depression and probably biological predisposition as well. And I had a few things happen in my life around that time as well, such as snapping ACLs in both of my knees and meeting my biological mum for the first time. All of this in that kind of final year of high school before deciding whether to go to university or what to do. So I think all of this instability.
Plus, you
Um,
live in England. That has to be factored in too. So
yeah, that was difficult too. So I think all of this instability sort of left me in a position as like a young adult or someone on the precipice of adulthood, sort of thinking, well, like how do I make sense of life? Like, what's the purpose of this? And I was certainly, very like suicidal for periods, and um, I don't know if I don't know if it I would say that religion was like a coping mechanism for that, but I think that having, I was really looking for some kind of framework that could provide me with answers as to like how to live or how to make sense of my suffering and stuff like that. And so I think someone like Peterson, who is providing, this really um sort of powerful and emotional message, about the importance of life and the importance of bearing your suffering, and that you matter, and as a young man who might feel disenfranchised and rejected maybe by society. I think a lot of that stuff really appealed to me. um, and so as I was recovering after those ACL surgeries, I really went down the kind of Peterson rabbit hole, as it were. And then that changed what my kind of recommendations were in the YouTube algorithm, I suppose. And I also started reading more as well around that time. So this is while I was doing that degree apprenticeship. Then, like I read Augustine's Confessions, right? That was one of the first sort of outwardly Christian books that I read, and it's one of the first autobiographies really ever written, and that was just really interesting to me because the whole thing is written as a prayer, and Augustine sort of introduces in his autobiographical form all of these like kind of dense philosophical and theological concepts, and I just found that really interesting. And then it was at the same time I started attending a Christian community to do a Bible study because I'd been inspired by Peterson's biblical series lectures, and so I started kind of adopting some of their beliefs, I suppose, over time, and that's how I ended up kind of becoming a Christian. And then just to kind of wrap up, I suppose, the story up until now, I was a Christian for around about a year and a half. From the point I would have said I was really like I'm a Christian now and I was committed to it, to the point when I probably deconverted. And then I went through a process after that of about 2 or 3 years now. Coming up to 3 years now, actually, of kind of processing what I would consider the trauma of adopting some very sort of costly and high control religious commitments, changing my life in kind of radical ways, adopting beliefs about the world and my ultimate destination and what's right and wrong and stuff that were very severe, and coming out of that, having that whole structure rocked. And so that's been a kind of journey. And I think the reason why I ended up studying a master's in philosophy was because I was kind of stuck with a whole bunch of these philosophical questions that are put up by religion, like what's the meaning of life? They kind of, I think apologists to convert people kind of have to sell people on problems they might not have thought they had in the first place in order to sell them the solution, right? So you have to get someone asking questions they might not have had about what is the meaning of life, what's my purpose, what really is morality all about, and I think a lot of people are just kind of getting on with their lives and not thinking about these things, and then you can be left with what is your answer, right? And I was certainly in that position. I think after I'd left religion, I'd thought I'd had answers to some of those questions within a religious framework, and so I just really had this intellectual itch to scratch, which is why I ended up doing this master's in philosophy. I've kind of finished that now, and I'm looking to work at like tech startups, really, which is why I pulled out of the PhD program. But so yeah, that kind of rounds off the story, I suppose.
Yeah, nice. Okay. So what is your dissertation on?
I did my master's dissertation on the fine-tuning argument.
Nice. Okay.
And that actually, my decision to specifically go down that route, I wanted to do my dissertation on methods and standards of success in philosophy. And my supervisor wasn't particularly happy with that because I think he thought it wouldn't be looked at fondly because it was very critical of a lot of the methods of philosophy. And I think he wanted me to focus more on like a first order issue in philosophy and argue, whereas I kind of wanted to take a step back and kind of criticize this idea of just kind of getting in at that point and offering these arguments. Like, well, let's ask some questions about what it is we're trying to achieve, what we think we're actually doing when we exchange these arguments, because I think that there's almost like this kind of game that's taking place at that level. And if you just step back and kind of look at what's taking place, you realize that there's a lot of kind of idling going on in the kind of exchanging of arguments and premises and stuff. And there's a lot of like blank checks that people provide that sometimes they're socialized into talking in these sorts of ways by philosophy. Like you reach a point that you first you're kind of taught that you have to kind of like justify all of your beliefs, right? And so the process of arguing is about offering justification for certain commitments that you hold, and then it turns out that actually you kind of can't do that. So then you reach these points in your kind of web of beliefs, and you're then given some ways that you can say something at least, which is like a legitimate move in the game, that you can like, oh, I've got this intuition about this thing. It just seems to me that really strongly that that's the case. And then you bottom out there, but then you still disagree with someone. And it's like, well, how do we move forward from that? So anyway, I wanted to do my dissertation on that. and then it ended up just being simpler to talk about a kind of argument that's current, and there's a kind of whole cottage industry around, right? Particularly with respect to theism versus kind of atheism as a discourse. The fine-tuning argument is often held up as something that offers some kind of scientific air of credibility for theism, and I think there are a lot of assumptions baked in that often go sort of unanalyzed, right, about what life is. And so that was really what I was focusing on in my dissertation. What are we actually talking about when we talk about life? Are we talking about something that is even compatible with theism as an explanation? Because a lot of people tend to talk about life in a way that is actually kind of incompatible with a possibility space that includes disembodied minds, right? Because the idea is that there are physical constants that are finely tuned, meaning that of all the values they could possibly take, they take a very small subset of them could support brains like ours, right? And but if in our possibility space we're considering like disembodied minds that can have all the kind of moral agency and intelligence and so forth that we do, well, that kind of changes the way that these fine-tuning calculations work. So that was the focus of my master's dissertation.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. I have a video probably 2 months ago or 3 months ago on the channel discussing fine-tuning with a guy named Keith Woods. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit. But first of all, what you say I think is true. You know, when your fundamental beliefs are shaken, you have to reevaluate everything. You're going to face some kind of existential crisis. I mean, that's a dangerous time psychologically. And both like conversion events and deconversion events can be traumatic. So, you know, epistemologically, why that would be the case, I think, is related to a kind of holism that is inevitable to a certain degree in epistemology. Like, you know, I'm a big proponent of the Duhem-Quine thesis that, you know, there's no isolated kind of brute force facts in nature. Any judgment about the state of affairs of the case presupposes a whole network of theories that we subscribe to. So that's the direction that I've taken epistemologically, and that, you know, it's a kind of middle ground potentially with justificationary methods and then anti-justificationism, like Karl Popper's anti-justificationist, a few others that I've dealt with been against that. David Deutsch, the physicist, is really strongly against justificationary methods, and they favor this kind of via negativa epistemological approach that's kind of evolutionary. So you set up your hypotheses, and our task is really to like knock them down. And there's real power there, but at the same time, viewed in the context of holism, there's no such thing as a brute force rejection of a theory either. So to reject a hypothesis is to rely on theories that will have to have some kind of justificationary basis at some level. It can't be via negativa all the way down, in my opinion. But what have you come to in that respect? Like, where do you fall, roughly speaking, in epistemology?
Yeah, so in terms of like formal philosophy at the minute, I sort of reject the whole thing, right? I mean, it depends. I think it depends on people's desires. If people enjoy having a discussion about the conceptual analysis of words like knowledge and things like that, then I'm happy for them to do it. But I just sort of enjoy other things a lot more. And I think the whole thing is just a very specific sort of game that philosophers are playing who enjoy that sort of thing, which is taking a whole set of ordinary words that we all know how to use, like belief and knowledge, and then applying the methods of philosophy to the use of those words. Now, if I'm playing that game, the set of commitments I will take, tend to be a kind of Quinean holism. I say a kind of because it's a sort of close. My view is a close relative, which is Wittgensteinian hinge epistemology. So basically, I believe that our beliefs are networked, or that's the best way of modeling them is as a kind of network, right? And in that network, or graph, however you want to talk about it, some nodes have higher degrees, which would be to say that some are more foundational, not foundational in the sense of like a foundationalist epistemology, which is saying that there's either some kind of like incorrigible belief, that's to say it can't be doubted, or it really latches onto the way that the world is, indubitably is something, and we can be certain of that. But what I'm saying when I say it's foundational is I just mean it's something that can change, that can move, but pretty much everything else in the belief system sort of moves around that thing, right? And those are what are called the hinges by Wittgenstein. And a good sort of metaphor that he gives is like a riverbed and the river. So you might think of, the river as these sort of more inconsequential beliefs, and the riverbed as those more foundational beliefs, right? So they do move over time. The river as it flows through kind of interacts with the riverbed and moves it around a bit, but that's going to take more time. So in the case of something like a belief in God, right, I think that would be a good candidate for a kind of hinge commitment that's going to inform a lot of someone's other beliefs. Now that can change over time, but the way, that generally isn't going to just be like the way that I don't know, you might believe that buying an iPhone versus a Samsung, right, is the best decision for you, and that might be kind of more inconsequential and might just flip, you might just change your mind about that from one day to the next. Whereas in the case of something like God, there's going to be a whole lot more going on, whether it be like trauma from relationships or abuse in a church or whatever the hell else, like that's going to like deconvert someone, or similarly in terms of converting people in, there's usually there's a whole trope of like conversion stories that people have, where I was doing drugs, I was down and out, I just got divorced or whatever, and then I and then I found a church community. And so I think that broadly speaking, the way that those hinge commitments change is pretty weird, and it's not, people are generally not reasoned at, but also the hinge commitments are things that generally don't stand in a place of justification. So that's to say, if someone asks me for justification for one of my hinge commitments, then I could sort of tell you a story there, right? I could bunch together some premises that would be to say like nodes in the graph that are connected to that thing, but actually the commitment itself, the hinge, is something that's believed more closely than the justification I would be offering you for it. It's sort of like if if you ask me why I believe I have two hands or something, right? Well, I could tell you a bunch of beliefs that are logically connected to my belief that I have two hands and put that in some kind of like argument form for you. But actually, my belief that I have two hands is more fundamental to me than like those other things that I would be telling you, telling you a kind of story about that entails that I have two hands. So that's sort of where I stand in terms of my epistemology and my views about that. I mean, it's close to a kind of Quinean holism, I suppose. But I generally think that like formal epistemology is not amazing, right? I mean, alongside Quine, I'm a fan of sort of naturalizing this particular branch of philosophy and turning it more into a sort of type of psychology. And I think there are more fruitful research programs in psychology and neuroscience, right, into the way that people form beliefs and what's actually going on there than I think the philosophical introspection stuff can only take us so far.
Okay. I mean, yeah, maybe artificial intelligence would be the right place to work out some of these epistemological problems. If you can build a machine that, can make functional models of its environment, that's got to be telling you something, potentially. But then with the, if you turn it into a branch of psychology, I mean, I just feel like there are certain ambiguous elements inherent to propositions about the state of our knowledge or the nature of knowledge that like will never be formalized completely, and there has to be this space, this ambiguous space of like just broad philosophical discourse to make sense of it. And I think it is possible, to make progress in science without reflecting on what we're doing in terms of our belief formation. But yeah, I would say like there's something that philosophy of science is doing And certainly, if you go back far enough, I mean, the attempt to like formalize the nature of true versus false or justified versus unjustified belief is what gave rise to logic in the first place. I think that's certainly a fruitful project. So, but yeah, so that's your epistemological stance, roughly speaking. You have described yourself as a naturalist. Can you give like a definition of what that is exactly, and why you went for that?
Yeah. So I think prior to offering any kind of definition, right, it's useful to just talk about what it is that we're doing in offering definitions. And I think often that in philosophical discourses, there can be this sort of idea that in offering a definition, what you're doing is you're providing some kind of essential characterization of the word you're using, right? Like you've got it, like the word stands for a thing, and you're now offering, right, essentially what that thing is, right? It's quidditas as whatever in the Latin. So usually that's not what I take myself to be doing when I offer definitions. I'm like in an ordinary sort of context, like now when I provide someone with a definition, I'm just trying to help them understand how I'm using a word, right? And I think there's something similar going on, when people write dictionaries, right? Like they define words in certain ways, so people who are unsure how to use words can sort of figure out how to use them. And so whenever I hear people just in philosophical discussions talk about definitions, I want to be wary of what people think's going on when a definition is being offered. So now, yeah, when I use the word naturalist, basically I'm using that word just to distinguish myself from a variety of positions that I disagree with, right? So I think it's very hard to characterize like what naturalism actually is. But I think that's the similar problem that theism and a whole bunch of other positions face, where it's very hard to characterize what they in fact actually are. But what you can say with something by saying something like naturalism is, well, I'm distinguishing myself from all these other views, right? So these would be views that include gods, include entities like demons, ghosts, a rejection of psi phenomena, so that like people study like remote viewing, like the men who stare at goats type stuff, like out of body experiences. I don't reject that people have those experiences, but like some kind of explanation of them, which is that there's something supernatural going on, right? And it is a somewhat circular way of defining the word, but the way in which I'm using it is just to distinguish what I believe from all of those things. So something that Graham Oppy says, for example, is there are none but natural causes, and reality is exhausted by natural entities. So that's just to say, again, all those entities like demons, gods, pixies, whatever, are excluded from reality, and all of causal reality is natural, and natural processes, natural things. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of philosophical disagreement about the way that I'm defining that word, right? But I think its use is to distinguish it from those other positions that include those sorts of entities and things.
Okay. Do you think that is kind of upfront ruling out psi phenomena? Like if we found, strong evidence that there was something to, for example, like, I don't know, mediumship. I've seen some studies actually, kind of double blind scenarios where they get a medium, purported medium, and ask them to recover certain information about a deceased person. And in some of these groups, they're getting statistically significant results. I mean, there obviously something could be awry in the experiments. There could be a interested party among the scientists there that's trying to advocate their view. That's probably the case with this guy William Tiller, who is one big proponent of psi phenomena. But I've looked into this stuff a bit. Do you think it's like upfront, not consistent with naturalism, that any so-called psi phenomena could be real, or what do you think?
So obviously, there are people who are using the word naturalism in different ways to me, right? Which might include some of those things. Now, for me, if something like, for example, if the mind is non-physical, because I use physicalism and naturalism interchangeably, really, and a lot of people don't do that. So if the mind is non-physical, or if the causal closure of the physical is violated or something like that, which might be what is, purported to be established by some of these like psi phenomena experiments, then I would say that's very strong evidence against like my theory, right? So there could be some psi phenomena which would fit in my type of naturalism, but I think there are certain things that they would have to be consistent with, right? So I'd have to be able to understand how that fits with like the causal closure of the physical. So if there was some kind of, or if there were weird things going on with like information, right, in the physical sense that physicists talk about information that violated some of our like established physics, then that would sort of be, again, very strong evidence against my sort of naturalism.
Okay. Could you define nature just real quick? Like, what do you mean by
that's
the physical?
Yeah. So I guess I mean all of reality, but that's not very useful. So maybe it's best to talk about how am I thinking about reality, right? And I'm thinking about reality, again, everything being wholly ontologically reducible to fundamental particles, right? The things that there are, that physicists and so on talk about. And I think about everything as like a four-dimensional manifold. So again, the way that physicists would think about the universe.
Okay. I've heard people say that the prevalent position among physicists today is that space-time is actually emergent from quantum information. So do you think that would violate naturalism, or?
I mean, it's not reductive naturalism, which is the view that I'm advocating for. I mean, maybe they just know some stuff I don't, right? And I've got to learn more. I'm not particularly someone who's particularly well versed in quantum physics, right? So maybe that's something that would change my view. Generally, when people talk about emergent things, I'm yet to study any example of emergence where the emergentist explanation is better, in my view, than a reductive explanation. But maybe quantum phenomena is, the thing where that's the case, right? Where you have some kind of emergentist laws, and that's and actually a reductive explanation just can't even explain it. I don't know, because I've not looked at that particular datum thing that stands in need of an explanation.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm not an expert in physics myself, so I tend to agree with those who say that space-time can't be fundamental, just because some phenomena, some experiments from physics are puzzling. Like even something as basic as the double slit experiment. I mean, how is it that we get this interference pattern when observation does not occur, does not occur, and then we get the two lines when there is observation, and you can say the wave function collapses. Oh, all right, but was the wave function distributed over space in the first place? I know the quantum state is in Hilbert space in physics, like in the mathematics of physics. So that's not in physical space. And we use Born's rule as a kind of rule of thumb to like map it onto a probability distribution over real space. So that already hints that like maybe there's something more fundamental going on than like particles moving through space, and how a particle could act as if it was distributed over space and then kind of recollect itself into a single thing. That's also curious. Are you committed to the idea that particles are fundamental? Again, I've heard people say that like what is the real entities are these quantum fields, quantum field theory, and particles are kind of emergent behavior of these underlying fields. I mean, that doesn't seem inconsistent with naturalism to you, does it?
It doesn't seem well. I think a type of naturalism, right, could include emergentist causal laws. Like I say, it's not one. It just isn't my favorite explanation currently, because I don't see anything that certainly stands in need. There are highly controversial sort of things that are generally posited as standing in need of like an emergentist explanation. So generally it's going to be consciousness or something quantum. And those are two sort of fields of study in which there's a lot of controversy and disagreement, and everything's like very recent. So I don't think I'm kind of driven there to abandon a kind of reductive explanation, though, you know, certainly I could be as more kind of evidence is gathered and we come to understand we have more experimental data to make sense of, you know, the experimental data we currently have. When it comes, so someone like Alyssa Ney would be someone who's far better to like read on this than me, because I just have these kind of layman's understanding of what's going on, and layman's understanding of even the various philosophical explanations that are available. Because I mean, it's just not something that interests me that much anymore. Like I don't think that much. If I wanted to be a physicist or something, which, you know, I don't even know if I could do at this point, given my like brain capacity and age and financial resources and stuff. Maybe I would care and devote everything to that, right? But otherwise, it just seems like a bit of a waste of time for me. But I mean, that being said, as far as I'm aware, there are several. I think on the Wikipedia page, it's something like 32 different sort of well established interpretations of quantum mechanics. I mean, the standard one that gets taught in universities is the Copenhagen interpretation. People like Sean Carroll tend to advocate for like the Everettian interpretation. There are interpretations that people who I would consider more fringe, like Bernardo Kastrup, go with, which postulate some kind of like conscious observer, right, as collapsing the wave function and having a role to play. There are other theories which are more kind of like quantum Bayesianism, right, which says that the kind of the probabilistic distribution that we're talking about is more a product of our uncertainty of what's going on there rather than something else. And I just think that we need to find out more, right? Because so all of these different explanations are empirically adequate in the sense that they make all of the predictions that are that we have experimental data for. If they didn't, then they would be ruled out as explanations. Some of them might be better than others insofar as they like postulate more things, or more kind of entities that are unique and not motivated by like other branches of knowledge that we have as well. But I just think we need to know more, right, to start kind of narrowing down what the best explanations are. And that's one for physics to do, really. I don't think I can figure that out from kind of introspecting. I don't think I have good intuitions about the way reality is as we start getting to these like really small, weird things that are happening. And so I'm happy to just say that, yeah, there's like a big kind of uncertainty for my overall philosophical worldview there, right, as to what direction that'll go in. It could be something that's inconsistent with my current naturalism, but it also might not be.
Okay, yeah. It's interesting to read like the founding fathers of quantum mechanics on some of this. Many of them were actually mystics, so they kind of had the belief that there was a underlying, more unitive reality, and then, you know, space-time is kind of this appearance out of that more unified underlying thing. In the correspondences between Pauli and Carl Jung, they talk about the kind of equivalence of this Hilbert space domain and, large-scale kind of quantum state-like objects serving the same role as archetypes in a collective subconscious. And yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting space, and for even non-experts, I think, to think about that question, whether you have good intuitions or not about the nature of reality. I mean, that would feed into your epistemological priors. Maybe that's one of your hinge beliefs. I mean, would you characterize your skepticism about your intuitions in that way?
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but I think that is more based on, rather than it being a thing from my priors, I think that's based off of a whole bunch of stuff I found out about the world. I mean, I think absent pretty much most evidence, you know, the idea that I would have good intuitions is going to have a relatively, well, it's either going to be that I may I have good intuitions or I don't, right? So maybe I did get 50-50 prior to any evidence or something. But I think it's as I've found out more about the world, that I've been like, oh, hang on, that's not at all what I thought it was like. I think most of my intuitions were probably more sort of Aristotelian in nature and even teleological. And I think that's borne out by the psychological literature, that people are sort of cognitively satisfied and expect and desire like teleological explanations more, that like the famous experiment with the triangles running around on the screen, where there's like one triangle that's like a big triangle that chases the little triangle. And I say chases, right, that because that kind of implies some kind of intention. But they ask kind of children and what's going on, and children are like, yeah, that one's like bullying the others and stuff, and really it's just triangles moving. And that's supposed to be suggestive of that we desire or think in terms of these sort of like personal or agentic explanations. And there's a lot of like cognitive science research in religion and the origins of religious belief as well, that sort of substantiate that. And obviously there are all sorts of problems you can talk about with the psychological research, and that's one for people who actually actively research in that area, I guess.
Right. I actually meant intuition more, in the context of intuitions about space in like the Kantian sense. So do you think that at that kind of deeper level, that you would expect intuitions to be reliable? I guess it's kind of tied into where you place mathematics in your ontology and how math is supposed to work. 'Cause I think it's clear that like human beings have access to some intuitions in that Kantian sense that allow objectivity in mathematics. And then if objective math maps onto objective physics, then it would give us a bridge to like ground intuition about the external world in deep sense. So do you think that there's something to that, or what do you think there?
Yeah, so my view of mathematics is that it's a human linguistic activity. And linguistic, we might be prone to sort of think of verbal noises, or in particular, or writing literature or something like that. And those are certainly what I'm talking about when I talk about linguistic activities. But I'm also talking about body language, the sort of movement, like I'm doing lots of stuff with my eyebrows and my face and my hands as I articulate, like you're nodding, right? I encompass all of these things under linguistic practices. They're all things that take place in space and time, according to, I mean, certainly the nodding and stuff. The controversial part is going to be whether we're expressing a sort of mysterious thing called a proposition which bears truth, right? And I don't think there's anything like that bears truth in this philosophical sense. I think truth is a word, and we both sort of understand what it means and are able to use it in space and time, as well, by making verbal utterances, writing things, assenting to things, engaging in those sorts of activities. So yeah, when I look at maths, I look at it as another one of these linguistic activities that people engage in. People are trained to write Hindu Arabic numerals, taught about like the successor function, taught addition and multiplication, how to go on, and and I think people who go into pure mathematics, like my girlfriend, for example, who's got her undergrad in maths and is doing a master's in maths part time while she works, in particular, develop a kind of appreciation for the the kind of people that when you get out there to the kind of more research in pure mathematics, it really is people kind of playing games, like setting down rules for how to manipulate symbols and how to think about things. And like, yeah, okay, occasionally it turns out that you can apply these things to certain fields in certain ways, and you can say that that's pretty interesting and pretty weird. But a lot of the time, particularly in the case of pure mathematics, it really is. It's almost like a really hyped up version of crossword puzzles or something, where you can define all these, like you basically define what it is that you're allowed to do with certain building blocks, and then you figure out if there's new cool things you can do, or you might sort of come up with a new term or a new symbol or something, or a new way of thinking about stuff. And yeah, from my point of view, there aren't any kind of like entities that are numbers or something that are referred to by words, or when I count 1, 2, 3, right, everything that's happening there that you saw happen before you, that I did with my fingers and the noises I made, that's all there is going on there from my point of view. And I'm just someone who's been socialized to do that sort of activity by my education and so forth. I don't know if that quite answers what the intent of the original question was, maybe, but yeah, that's some meat on the bones of my views about maths.
Sure. Okay. I've been very influenced by Max Tegmark on this question, and he makes some powerful arguments, I think, that there's more to math than linguistic convention. I mean, the fact that it works to describe physical reality is curious. Also, the fact that it's not that we observe the empirical world and then develop math to describe it in all cases. Very often, a mathematical discovery will ex post facto be applied to some new physical discovery. Mathematics of fractals anticipated their discovery application in various natural systems, the phi ratio, stuff like that. So that's, something that I think would need to be explained. Like, why does math have this very robust ability to map the physical world? If one is totally arbitrary convention and one is the objective nature of things, why do they seem so inherently wedded together? Like, where did that Cartesian, or I guess Galilean, confusion in the first place come from?
Sure. So it's interesting that for you, that seems sort of like strange, which I think this comes from, like Eugene Vinger's paper, the unreasonable applicability of mathematics. And this is something that a lot of apologists and William Lane Craig have been pushing recently, like why is it that mathematics works in our world? And I think under my view, it's actually very unsurprising that mathematics works, because it's something that people have come up with, right? So the stuff that was useless, people just stopped doing for the most part, right? If it wasn't applicable, then it didn't do anything for people. It didn't help them in their various activities, whether that be agriculture and farming or engineering or whatever else. So the fact that the mathematics that we do have is the useful stuff, I think is actually very expected under, like, the mathematics that most people learn, for example, that we teach in education. That stuff's all fairly useful to people's lives, and I think that all fits very nicely with the idea that people have come up with this stuff and it happens to be beneficial for the types of lives that we lead. What was the second part of the question? Sorry, I've forgotten. I'm a little bit ill, so my head's not quite...
Yeah, no worries. Why does math work is the main question that I was asking. And this, basically an evolutionary explanation, gets us, I think, part of the way there. I don't know that actually tracks, like, the history of development in mathematics. Why it is... There's a deeper question here where, like, okay, we're a naturalist, we're a physicalist, and mathematics is a kind of linguistic construct. Was it true, let's say, like, at the beginning of the universe, before human beings existed, that there were a certain set of coherent, symbolic mathematical languages that could have been agreed upon by human observers? It's like the fact that we agree on these, like, little Sudoku puzzle type abstract mathematical systems means there's some functional, integrity that certain symbolic systems have. And it's not just that it's been selected for fitness, but there's a kind of prior selection for intelligibility among mathematical systems. So do you think, like, at the outset, before the creation of man, or the evolution of man, was there like a possibility space of coherent mathematical structures, or do they for the first time just like snap into being when someone puts it down on the paper? I guess that's also tied to your theory of time. So where do you fall on a theory of, there's two questions there, theory of time and what, like, were possible mathematical systems possible or impossible before they happen, and then the time question.
So, yeah, theory of time, I guess, like most of these like heavily theory laden philosophical topics, I honestly don't have a very strong view and don't like care that much. But if someone really annoyed me and I wanted to like debate them and make them look silly or something, I'd probably go with like growing block B theory. But I'm just trying to figure out like how I'd motivate myself to care enough, right, to talk about philosophy of time. So yeah, at the initial point of you've got to think about what the question is, I think, that you're asking when you're asking me to kind of conceive of these conceive the question that you're asking me about the mathematical languages, right? Because I'm not 100% sure what the question is. Now I think it's if I imagine myself there, would I be able to describe things mathematically or something like that? I mean, I guess I'm just not
Okay,
sure.
yeah, I'll just reiterate the question real quick. So, in fact, certain mathematical languages are functional. Like if I write down random scribbles, that doesn't amount to a coherent symbolic language that mathematicians can use and agree upon. So there's a finite set of symbolic languages that function coherently for the mathematicians' purposes. Regardless of what exactly undergirds their truth values or whatever, there's a certain set of things that count as math and things that don't count as math. It seems like, was that true before math developed? Like before, I know that there's geometry before Euclid, but whatever. Before Euclid set down the axioms and developed the system, was there what he could have feasibly done and what he could not have feasibly done in terms of developing workable mathematics?
Yeah, I think I understand the question a bit better now. So, so if someone, for us as English speakers, what mathematics means is a particular, so we wouldn't call someone with a blue light, right? Imagine I had a blue torch and I was just flashing it every so often, right? We wouldn't call that maths, because that's just not how we understand the word maths as competent English speakers. So if someone who's similarly trained in English in the same way that we are were to sort of observe the start of the universe, right, and look at it, they probably would be saying, yeah, there's no maths there, but it could be described mathematically still, right? But there's no one doing maths. There's no one engaging in this activity. But then there's sort of this separate question of, would it be possible for us to include other activities in what we call maths? And then I think it is, right. So then there are some cases that are more clear. So we can see, for example, as things like I don't know, take like graph theory or something, have been incorporated into mathematics. Well, that's very different to sort of arithmetic. So maybe there are some things that are kind of similar, right, that you might see in computer science now, where you go, well, yeah, that's sort of, it doesn't look like traditional maths, but you can see how that sort of is maths, so could be included. But I want to say that actually any radical activity, so long as we were to sort of agree that it belonged, to maths, and we would truly say, yeah, that's maths. And I think it's just a matter of familiarity, right, and what we were kind of happy to say. And our reasons for doing so could be numerous. It could be like social pressure. It could be just what we were taught in school or whatever. But I think there's no reason that people every so often going, and waving a pen around, right, couldn't be what we call maths. And the meaning of the word could encompass that activity for us as well. And it's just because.
Oh, how about this? I just want to. Aristotle in interpretation has a conventionalist position on the development of terms, but then he believes that the notions are universal and natural. Right. Yeah. So those. Sure, we could use math as a term to designate anything, but isn't there a natural notion of mathematics? Like any intelligent species would come up with the natural numbers. It's not like a wholly arbitrary human invention.
It depends. So, I mean, it depends on the biology of that species for me as to whether it would be possible for them participate in the same mathematical activities that we do. I don't think it's sort of inevitable or even more likely that they would share the same mathematical activities that we do. I mean, you need to build a lot more into the question, I think, to kind of make sense of it. But if we have like primates kind of like us or whatever, or in a similar ecological niche, but I can sort of tell stories, about there are even cultures where it's been very hard to, like the Piraha that Daniel Everett has studied, the sort of go-to example, where it's very difficult for anthropologists to even make sense of, to try and find what mathematics is in their paradigm, just because, well, first, there's no like one-to-one translating between languages, particularly languages that don't share histories or a lot of history. So it might be more easy to do that between like European languages, right, which share this common history, but an isolated tribe like the Piraha has far less in if it has anything in common, it goes way further back and a lot more stuff's happened. So it's not like you can go, okay, well, what does mathematics translate to? Right? That's kind of difficult. But then also it turns out, once you think you have got a grasp of what's going on when they engage in various activities, it's like they count 1, 2, 3, many, 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 many. And that's how their like linguistic practice functions. It's not clear that they have the same like arithmetic operators as we do and stuff like that. Now, they can be, obviously, I think, be trained to participate in our mathematical activities. And maybe you could say, well, our mathematical activities are better because they're more useful. They enable us to have these like massive economies, which mean we can have like, more calories and food and stuff and computers to do more fun things. So people can be trained to have, and you could say their discourse is like worse, right? Because it doesn't lead to these things. Maybe it would if it scaled up, who knows? But I just think they're different. I don't think like one is really attaching to the way reality is, and one isn't like attaching to the way reality is. I think I look at them as just things that like biological organisms like ourselves can learn to do, which can be useful for particular ends in particular ecological niches, right? So counting in the way that English people do has been very useful for me throughout my life. My training in that has been less useful when I've had some tasks as a software engineer where I've had to count in like hexadecimal or something, and maybe my intuitions about what's going on with numbers in base 10 are all weird and thrown on the head all of a sudden, and I have to socialize myself into a new kind of practice. But yeah, I don't think there's any particular like entered, like in my view, there aren't like propositions or something before the mind, like, or anything like mathematical propositions which are being grasped mentally and that we're really attaching into. And like, the Piraha, when they say whatever they say, I say the first 3 numbers, but I mean, that's kind of sloppy, right? Because it isn't even like 1, 2, 3. Yeah, and again, for me, I would say, this whole, even the whole project that philosophers have of then trying to like reduce mathematics to like set theory or logic or something like that. I mean, again, that's one of those things you can do if it's interesting. Maybe there'll be some practical stuff that falls out of the attempt to do that, but it's not. I don't think. I think we're sort of like building the raft as we go along when we do that. I don't think we're like really finding out something significant about the world out there, though the stuff we come up with might be able to be applied to stuff out there in very useful ways. Like, but a bunch of the weird stuff in pure maths, again, the stuff that tends to hang around because it has these applications, can be applied in these, I don't know, weird examples when people are running like massive Kubernetes clusters or something, and they want to figure out how they scale their applications and stuff. All of a sudden, yeah, like this weird bit of esoteric graph theory or something is really useful all of a sudden, and now that's something that more people know about than did. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like if it was as arbitrary as you seem to be characterizing it, then we would have like multiple sets of fully coherent, consistent number theories. but we don't. I mean, there are elements of number theory that are debatable and people have different ideas, but like which numbers are prime is not one of those issues. And like everyone agrees with certain properties of numbers, no matter, there's no coherent alternative. So it makes it seem like it's natural because of that, right?
So when you're asking a question like which numbers are prime, you're already assuming the linguistic practices, or on my view, linguistic practices of our mathematics, right? So you can't frame a question like which numbers are prime from, you know, the alien flashing blue light thing that could possibly be incorporated into mathematics as an activity. That might turn out to be very useful for Google if they knew about it. if their software engineers were able to do the flashing blue light alien thingy, then they'd have all sorts of, you know, intuitions that'd be very useful or something. You can't frame a question like which numbers are prime without assuming like our number system, right? Because we're talking about factors, we're talking about the integers, and we've already put in place all the pieces, so to speak, such that we're in our linguistic practice there.
Okay. I mean, still to my mind, abstract systems, it seems like there is this kind of realm of pure true false propositions that characterize the systems, like even something like chess, the moves that are possible on the chessboard, like once you establish the rules of chess, you define like an infinite set of legal games, and that's not arbitrary. And when you play a game, in a sense, you're just discovering a natural entailment that flows out of this rule set. But then the question is, well, is the rule set fully arbitrary? And I think if you scale that process of setting rules down far enough, there's going to have to be some kind of hardware component in like neurological circuitry, and maybe that's where like the way that we are able to set rules is necessarily connected to the laws of physics or something like that. Michael Levin, biologist, has this point about like the evolution of biological systems, that like, you know, evolution doesn't do everything in giving functionality to cells. There's also like this, they kind of get free rides at certain points in their evolution when they tap into natural laws, right? It's not just the matter of the thing, it's the laws that structure the cell that allows it to do what it does. And so if a cell develops something that functions as a transistor, all of a sudden the laws of logic, you know, snap into place, and you have access to a whole bunch of operations functionally as an organism that you did not have before you tapped into that kind of Platonic realm of logical operations.
I'm just turning down my heater, by the way. I'm not.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, but we can, I mean, let this point lie. That's perfectly fine. Definitely, I think.
I don't mind.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, though. So would you say that you're like a nominalist generally?
Again, like that's one of those debates that I don't really care for, and I think has a bunch of assumptions baked into it, like that you need to provide, you know, some philosophical theory about the grounding of universals or whatever. That, you know, what I actually believe is that that's a useless conversation to be had. Now, if someone again wants to like have this deep and profound philosophical discussion, I can sort of defend whichever position is the opposite of the person I don't like, I suppose. So, I mean, usually that's going to be something like Quinean paraphrase, or like class nominalism, or resemblance nominalism, ostrich nominalism. But it depends on the context, you know. Like again, I just don't think it's that important of a question. I don't even think there are really. I don't think people are really asking like well-formed questions in that debate, right? So it's something I generally try to avoid, unless someone's kind of like upset me and I want to make them look silly. Then I'll be like, oh look, here's a bunch of stuff I know about this you don't.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I just kind of wanted to apply it back to the concept of nature and the physical, because to my mind, I mean, those concepts can't be very meaningful unless there's some level of realism supporting them. So when you say that like the existing entities are space, time, matter, all of those are universals, right? Not particulars. So at least those universals have to have some kind of reality to make naturalism like a meaningful thing, I think.
It depends on your natural, like, so my view of language is very different to the one that's been sort of assumed in that question. Because my view of language is that meaning is use. So, there isn't like a proposition that's a bearer of truth in my view. I'm an English speaker and I'm able to successfully communicate just in case I sort of achieve my goals in moving my face and body in the way that I'm doing it and making the noises that I do. And fortunately for me, most of the people I interact with are also trained in this same sort of elaborate system with enough of an idea that I can sort of cause them to go on as I intend to. And if they don't, then we have these other sort of like little linguistic practices about, well, what does that mean? Have you understood? And all that sort of stuff that hopefully they're trained into as well. And there's even the possibility of there being so much disagreement that I just can't communicate with people. That's something that happens all the time as well. So yeah, when we talk about when you talk about the things that you're referring to as universals, I mean, I think there's a part of philosophical discourse, right, where philosophers say the word universal, and then go about this other bit of linguistic practice called offering candidate explanations and debating, right? And so I agree that those words exist. What I don't agree that's happening is that there's a thing called a universal, which is referred to by certain terms that philosophers say are universals. Now, supposing I did accept that, then what I could do is talk about the philosophical debate, which I hate so much, which is basically a question of grounding relations, right? So grounding relations are supposed to be relations of what's more fundamental to what in reality. And so the views that broadly fall under Platonism or Aristotelianism are going to say that universals our talk of universals is grounded in the universals themselves. And then there's a kind of alternative set of views which will say that our talk of universals is actually grounded in the particulars that they're instantiated in some sense, right? And so there are various disagreements then that people can have. So you can talk about, well, okay, here's a potential view that there are classes, resemblance classes of particular things, and I can, as it were, construct my categories out of those resemblance classes. Now that doesn't commit me to some like spooky entity that I can't really tell you about how it exists and why it's completely different from everything else and why it violates like the laws of physics and stuff. And so maybe that's one way of comparing explanations that's better. Another way of doing it is like the Quinean paraphrase way, right? Where you say what people are doing is really paraphrase for, and then insert some kind of like logical mumbo jumbo. There is some X such that X is, has property C or something. Or F is the typical one that philosophers go with. You can be an ostrich nominalist, apparently, where you just bury your head in the sand and don't offer any explanation, but you promise nominalism is true. That's apparently an available position. You can be a trope theorist. Oh, where there are, what are there? Thin and thick tropes or something like that. Tropes which have the property or tropes which instantiate the property. And basically you just create some new words and that's meant to sort of explain stuff somehow. And even a lot of theists like go for this, like this is what Joshua Sijwadi goes for. And he even builds a whole argument for God out of this, saying that, like God is like the ultimate trope or something. Like I say, for me, all of that stuff is just like gibberish nonsense. And I'm like, that's just not how I just reject the framing of the question in the first place. From my point of view, what's happening is just that people are using words as they've been trained to do, and that's a thing that takes place in space of time. I don't have to explain some like process of referring or some kind of entity that means something and attaches to all particular instances of something. because my explanation is just fully in terms of the linguistic practices of English speakers, or whatever other language we might be talking about.
Okay. Specifically, the way we talk about like fundamental reality, if you're a reductive naturalist, that fundamental reality is space-time causality, basically. And it seems like the way that we talk about it, these concepts functionally treat them as universals. Like space isn't a particular space. Space is something that's distributed in many particular instantiations. There's this space, this time, that time, and then there's time and space. And also, like, if you believe in the quantum fields model, quantum field theory, and just kind of the standard model, then there are these kind of undifferentiated energetic fields that instantiate in one place or another when the circumstances is right for it. Right. So that looks to me like some kind of layered kind of Platonist like ontology, where it's not like the bottom level isn't space, time, and all the objects in it. The bottom level would be, space, time, the gravitational field, the electromagnetic field, etc. So what do you think of that position? Like, do you is nature composed of pure particulars, or could there be like a finite set of quote unquote universals that have this ability to instantiate in particular places when the setting is right for them?
So in answer to like, could that be? I mean, like, yeah, it's epistemically possible. Like, it's possible. I'm wrong, right? And some alternative philosophical view is correct. In terms of my view of what reality is made of, just all the stuff that physicists talk about, I'm happy to commit myself to, really, and say that reality is exhausted by that. And then in terms of like a question about why is there something in common to all of these, a plurality of things that are different, like something that's in common in a mind independent way or whatever, that would just be a question for physics. I mean, if it appears in a working model of physics, then yeah, sure, I'll ontologically commit myself to that. If it doesn't, and it remains in a philosophical theory, then I don't see any need to commit myself to that.
Okay, yeah. It's struck me that what I see from physics, where you do have these kind of universals in a sense, fields, whatever, and they're instantiating particular places, that kind of grounds in the same way that Platonists would say that the form grounds the term or its truth in some sense, then that would give a ground for talk of space or time. Because if you're talking about pure particulars, then I don't know how linguistic reference ends up being efficacious. I don't think evolutionary explanations get us all the way there. It's not just that like whatever utterances happen to direct us in the right direction, won out and those mapped onto, in some functional sense, ultimate reality, but we're not talking about like concrete things with the terms, concrete universals rather. So for me, it's like, how do you ground? I know you seem to like dismiss this whole discourse about grounding truth claims, but like, how do you do that exactly, and why does it work? Why does the language of physics actually function to engineer things, to make predictions? It all seems to work very well. So what accounts for the efficacy of language? This kind of the conventionalism all the way down doesn't seem to cut it.
So what accounts for why physics works so well is that if we look at the kind of history of physics and where it's come from, it's that there's a kind of story to be told about this human activity in universities of thinking about the world in particular ways. It's turned out that way of thinking about things has been incredibly powerful for the people who have done it, insofar as it's allowed them to make things and do things in the world that people who didn't engage in that activity couldn't do so. And so that has enabled individuals in societies which have practiced physics, and those societies, groups, communities, to flourish more, and then to encourage people to do that physics. The unsuccessful theories, the ones that haven't been useful, have not survived, right? They've not been passed down, or maybe someone will look into them in some kind of like obscure PhD thesis on, why, people always reference like the theory of caloric or something, right? But very few people ever really go into what it has to say about anything. And it's just because those theories are not as useful for us as the alternatives, which we've instead adopted and continue to teach people in high school, and then people go into university. Some people go on to universities and they develop a more ingrained understanding of those things. And and on that view, all that's taking place is that people again coming up with ways of talking about things, ways of engaging in activities. So I mean, language here is viewed as an activity that takes place in space and time. We can construct I want to distinguish what I'm saying from like a constructivist or fictionalist position, but we can, so perhaps the use of the word construct isn't helpful there, but we can come up with new words or tokens of language with different conditions of use, which we can then teach people those conditions of use, or they might then take that word and maybe modify it, start using it in a slightly different way. The ones that work will catch on. The ones that are successful, and then we have what successful means is different in different contexts. Unfortunately, it can mean the capacity to get a grant or to get published, right? Which is why there's so much trash around in academia these days, perhaps to in the past when funding structures and things were slightly different. But I think insofar as we incentivize and encourage like doing things with our theories, then we end up with theories that can do more over time as we encourage people to kind of like come up with them and work on them. I just don't really see a requirement for like entities called propositions there, or things that bear truth, or even you talked about reference, right? There's nothing in my view that's like people. I can refer to things in the sense that I can say nouns, and what I mean by them might be a thing that I point to. But again, that's a whole activity, and I think we can get lost in this metaphor of the way that we tend to learn nouns by pointing at them and saying, like mouse or pen or whatever, right? And then I think in the philosophical context, we sort of get confused and think that inwardly there must be this process of pointing going on when we use our words. And again, I just don't think there is. I think that what's taking place is everything you see before you, my facial movements and the noises I make and so forth. And just as long as you go on sort of the way I expect, we have agreement and concordance.
Yeah. So the evolutionary explanation, once again, I don't think empirically that actually works for that. It's kind of like the 100 monkeys typing for 1,000 years. Eventually you get the works of Shakespeare or whatever. I don't think there's been enough physicists putting forth models and then being tested for their use value in different societies for that kind of evolutionary explanation to like bear the,
well,
the
it's
burden
not exactly
there.
analogous there, is it? So that the idea of the monkeys typing is that you have a sort of a random character generator, as it were, with infinite resources. And so this is a sort of way maybe of thinking about like a probabilistic way that something random might be working. But I don't think that there's anything random. Well, there might be some things random going on causally in terms of the quantum levels or whatever, but I don't think there's very much random going on when we talk at the level of like human organisms operating. I don't think that physicists, people who choose to do like a PhD thesis in physics, are making arbitrary or random decisions. Like it just kind of I think that their decisions are motivated by all sorts of like reasons and desires that they have, the stock of knowledge that they have about the previous physics, which constrains the set of skills that they have, right? So it's not the case that there's like a random activity generator, and it's like, well, what my thesis is going to be on, pop like random random thesis.generate. That's actually informed by the stock of knowledge that they already know, which has been constrained and narrowed down over time. And then there are demands for like funding or what's interesting or whatever that also go into so it's very different, I think, from the idea of like there being a sort of random thesis generator and then just certain things stick around. I think that that there's kind of like a lot of constraints going on.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. It's not like the monkeys, but I don't understand what it is about the behavior of those physicists that would allow them to perform better than the random number generator, unless in their introspection, in their thought of physical systems abstractly, there is some correspondence between the mental representation and the nature of the physical world. Like they have to have access to physical intuition in order to get past random chance. Because like a bunch of stuff happening in the past doesn't warrant itself. Yes, they have like previous physical theories to look to, but I mean, then they'd be in the same boat as like a random number generator that has the partial document in front of them and then goes about randomly generating. Like there has to be something that gives them an edge over the random number generator. I don't know what that is for you exactly. Also, I don't know what it is that like explains. So if the useful thing theories win out, I still don't quite understand what it is that makes them useful, what grounds their usefulness, why are these certain theories useful, you know?
Yeah. So I mean, for a large number of what we might call the more basic activities, I mean, it's literally death, right? The humans that have stuck around have done so from their capacity to sort of gather resources and so forth, and the various, there are various kind of things, like you might say our capacity to produce noises through our voice box, or to have the kind of like digits we have that have more so been selected for by death. And then there are also like dispositions in our neurology, right? So you might say like certain things to do with like altruism or preferences to sort of like help other people in the group has been like a successful strategy. So maybe like certain ideas about helping people in the group and stuff, those sorts of things might have been selected for, which might predispose us to act in a certain way. So that narrows down the possibility space from like literally anything to like what's physically possible for an organism like me, right? Then I think we also have other selection pressures which are created by societies and cultures. Cultures are sort of weird things insofar as it's not always exactly death which is being selected for, but there are all sorts of like rituals and even what success is that we sort of collectively create. So, if we look at our current economic I mean, it's kind of weird because it does cluster around it does tend to cluster around resources, right? So I mean, if you look at the number of kids that like NBA stars have, like the number of women they sleep with is like insane sometimes. I mean, obviously not for all, because people have different desires and so forth. Or if you look at someone like Elon Musk and the number of, like, he's had like 7 so having a lot of wealth, being successful in certain ways or whatever, certainly provide someone with the capacity to care for kids. I think there are people with other strategies as well. And when I say strategy, I don't necessarily mean something that's conscious. Like I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to do this, but I just mean what the person is in fact doing. And that might involve like actually sleeping around and not caring for the kids and stuff. And that kind of seems to work for some people. But I just think there's this really complicated story to be told about the system that we've created in terms of the economics of it, the kind of like the linguistic practices of like talking about our values and desires, even the stories we tell, right, about what's a good thing to do, like in the Lion King or in Frozen or whatever. And I think all of these things come together to inform like the decisions that any individual organism makes. It's like, I mean, if you're asking me for sort of an explanation of everything, it does happen to get that vague, because it really is like, well, it's just everything that's taking place, right, is really, really complicated. What's going on as to why any particular physicist like chooses their thesis over some other thesis. And I don't think there really is like unless there's a more kind of well-formed specific question, I don't think that there's like some general hypothesis that's going to be useful there of like why physicists choose their theses.
Right. Yeah. The question is more like why certain theses work. Let's put it this way: if I develop a mathematical model and that is effective, to my mind, there has to be some kind of correspondence between the nature of the mathematical model and the nature of the physical reality it's describing. Syntactically, maybe not in terms of the individual characters that are used, but the syntactic structure, like the network of relations that constitute the model, has to map in some way to the physical reality. And if that's
I think
so,
you want to say
then
semantic rather than syntactic there. Like I understand what you're saying, and I think it's a very tempting way to think about things, right? So the reason I say semantic is because I think what you want to think, what the model you're advocating for, is sort of that there is, you know, this thing in the mind, which I've been quite keen on insisting. I sort of don't think there is, you know, no beetle in the box on my view. You know, like a kind of picture or a representation or something. Now that's not me saying I can't think of things, but I'm saying I don't. I think there's a misguided initial way of talking about it, which gets away with too much. And as we kind of actually introspect on what's going on, I think we find that we've just sort of accepted a way of talking about things that isn't, you know, what really seems to be going on. But yeah, so I think the idea is, you know, not syntactically, but semantically, that the word expresses an idea or a proposition or something, and that's like a picture of states of affairs in the world in some way. And then there's this correspondence, right, between that model, we might say, or that picture, and the way things are in the world. I mean, feel free to come back.
No, I would defend the. Oh, sorry, I forgot I was muted. Yeah. So I would defend syntax because I think in mathematical systems, the semantic content of a variable is defined by its syntactic relations, and that's it. Like that's what makes it a mathematical system. So.
Well, not there is syntax and semantics in mathematics, right? So
for a formal closed system, the semantic value of a given point in the system has to come from its relations to the other points, right? Don't you think?
I mean, I'm just not sure what that means really, because, you know, insofar as I understand semantic, suppose. So there's like a theorem, right, in graph theory that that there's an Euler circuit for any graph, any connected graph with where all of the vertices have an even number of degrees or something like that, right? And that's a theorem in graph theory. And that the semantics of that is what the proposition is supposed to mean, right? And then the syntax of it would be the particular grammar that you're expressing it in. So that can be expressed in like some kind of predicate logical language, right? Where we have like the upside down A, like for every X, you know, and then we'd use symbols to mean like our particular predicates or whatever. And then the reason that syntax is useful is because it enables you to like compute things, because there are rules for syntax. So it's mindless computation, really, like literally it's manipulation of the symbols purely. And there are rules that guide and permit that. Whereas I think when mathematicians talk about the semantics of it, they're really talking about what it actually means to them, like the understanding. And I think that's what leads us into this like picturing idea of a proposition bearing truth, because it's like that is a true proposition. Well, what does it mean? What does it stand for? What does it
Okay. My meaning was really essentially like if you say x plus y equals z, then I mean the semantic content of x, as far as, because we don't know what x is, it's empty, but it is, you know, like z minus y. We know that. And that's strictly syntactically determined. Yeah. So I think that's just narrowing in, leaving semantics aside, just the syntax of a physical theory, mathematical theory. There has to be a relation, I think, to the structure of underlying reality. And that's where I would say, well, okay, the easiest way to make that work is if there's something language-like about reality as well. So just like you have a syntax of mathematical objects and a mathematical expression, you have a syntax of physical objects, and they're like there's an analogy between language and the nature of things. And I'm not the first person to say that. Obviously, there's some kind of logos at work and in the world. I think that allows you then to like ground, why do certain physical theories work? There are the theories where the syntax of the math maps onto the syntax of the physical world. And otherwise, what accounts for the usefulness? Not like how it came to be and how it was selected for, but because that, I think that kind of just ignores the question of why does the one that wins out win out? Why does it actually work?
Right. So I do think that what you're going for there, you want to go with semantics rather than syntax. And I'll try to explain why in maybe a better way. So if we're talking about the syntax as like the basically grammatical permissibility of certain statements, right? What we're talking about is a formal language where there are marks on a page, basically. Now, we're going to have a meta language, which is usually going to be our ordinary language that we just assume we speak, you know, usually English, right, for us as English speakers. And we can leave a whole bunch of difficult questions about the meta language aside and just assume we speak English and that we're kind of common with the practices of writing English and stuff. And all of a sudden, what we kind of do, we define our language quite rigorously by making marks on a page and saying like, you know, this symbol means this, or this symbol permits like these moves or whatever, right? But the syntax there, in terms of, you know, what's a well-formed formula, for example. So you might have one arithmetic language which permits like x plus y equals, or you might have another. You know, one way in computer science that things often get expressed is something called Polish notation, right? So then you'd have the two variables like x, y, and then you have plus afterwards. And the reason for that is because it makes it easier to parse the syntax in a tree. But the point is that the syntax there is it's entirely physical. Like it's physical in terms of it's like written on a page, you know, like the brackets are there or the brackets aren't there, and that's the syntax. And the semantics is supposed to be like what this thing means rather than what's like permissible with the symbols on a page, right? And so the syntactic view of just of the symbols on a page is more what I'm saying. I'm like, we've kind of got lost in it because we're so comfortable with our practices and with doing these things in sort of metaphors of grasping entities. Just because we're so familiar with like counting and stuff, we think that there's like an inward thing we're pointing to, rather than that we're just trained to make like noises in space and time or do things and stuff like that. You know, do things with our fingers and so on. That's my view, right? Is almost like really reducing everything down to the syntax. Whereas I think the semantic view is to say, no, like this, it means something. Like and when I say means, I don't just mean people doing stuff successfully, like you mean, Nathan. I mean, it means something in that there's something grasped like before the mind, and that's like shared by everyone who understands this proposition or something. And that's something that's grasped has to like attach to the world in some way. So say if I say, you know, 1 + 1 = 2, and you understand that, and that's like true of something in the world. Like there's some kind of correspondence between the thing that's grasped in my mind, like the statement 1 + 1 = 2, and the things that it's true of, like these two rocks. Like there's one rock and another rock, and they equal 2, or whatever. And that's, you know, that's what I would call like a picture theory. And I think that's where the disagreement is. And I think what you're saying is, like, well, if what I'm saying is right, and the universe is just made of like physical stuff, how is there room for like these different entities that there needs to be like these kind of relationships between, like the thing that's grasped in the mind, and even perhaps the like perspectival aspect of the grasping and that thing's relationship to like the rocks, right? I think that's what you're asking, if that helps to clarify the potential disagreement.
Yeah, it's getting a little thorny, so I'm not even 100% on that. But I would say, like, I'm concerned with okay, if the syntax is like possible operations that you can manipulate on the page or that you can manipulate on a computer chip, then I think it's strong evidence that physical reality has a syntactic structure and therefore is language-like in some respect.
I guess I'm not really sure what that means, right? Because when I talk about syntax, I'm talking about the grammar of languages, and like what is a permissible construct of like symbols, where by symbols I mean like the little things that people make to use in languages, like impressions in clay, or perhaps like imprints, whatever.
Right.
And so for reality to have a syntax, it just doesn't really. It's kind of like saying my table has a syntax, isn't? Like it's just not the sort of thing that has a syntax. I don't really understand what it means to say reality has a syntax.
I would say like a network of relationships between any abstract objects is syntactic. So like generalizing from grammar, physical objects, I think the relations that they have, permissible operations that they have, are syntactic in character, at least analogically. And so I wonder if that analogy between so-called physical syntax, as I'm terming it, and then linguistic syntax, if we could use that in a kind of pseudo-Platonist or maybe fully Platonist sense to ground the truth of physics, because otherwise I'm still just kind of at a loss for like why a particular physical theory actually works, not how it was selected for, but like why does the use function?
Yeah, I still think semantic might be. It could be that I'm misunderstanding you, right? But as I put the word like a syntactic relationship between our language and a Platonic form, I guess I just don't really understand. That doesn't really make sense to me. So like two different languages, okay. In English, we indicate the direct and indirect object, and if you don't know what those are, I'll introduce them. But in English, we indicate them by where they are in the sentence. So I might say like Tom is taller than Sally, right? And we know who the one that's taller than is in English, because Tom is to the left of the is taller than, and Sally is to the right of the is taller than, right? Whereas in a language like Greek, the direct and indirect object are actually indicated by inflection, which is like a different ending on the word. So I don't actually know what is taller than is in Greek, but the whatever it is would be there, right, still in a particular case. But Tom, the name, would be there with what's called a genitive ending on the end, which would indicate he's the direct object. And Sally or Sue, whoever the hell said, she would be there with a nominative ending, which would indicate that she's the indirect object. So she'd be the one that's shorter than, or whatever, right? In that sentence. And so that's the syntax of the language, right? Defining that the different way that you express the direct or indirect object is with case endings in Greek, whereas it isn't in English. The syntax of English is that it's like the sentence structure. But if there's a meaning to those two sentences, right? In the one in English and the one in Greek, that's shared by them both, that expresses some kind of like Platonic form or something, right? Of like this taller than relationship. Well, then it can't be the case that the syntax is shared between the Platonic form and the expression in language, because we have a different syntax, right, in both of those languages, and apparently the same, but the one Platonic form that's shared by the two expressions. So I think what we're talking about here is the semantics, which is supposedly what's expressed, or what's being expressed in language or what's meant by the sentence, and that the Platonic form or essence or whatever is like the that shares the semantics of what's expressed in language. I don't know if that helps clarify.
Yeah, well, I'm not actually talking about Platonic forms. I'm more talking about the mathematicals, like the kind of second level beneath the forms, because those logoi would be the structuring principles of nature. Also, we have the same logoi in our mind for Platonists. So that's the specific like syntactic correspondence between the logoi of nature and like the laws of natural operations, and what, like what's permissible for objects in the world, same as what's permissible grammatically. That's kind of the analogy there. So that's why I'm calling that physical syntax what grounds the linguistic, like the validity of linguistic syntax. The semantics, I think probably an element of the forms has to come in there to ground ground the meaning for an individual, because we don't get a meaning unless there's a joining together of the many instances that appears in our minds. For something to be meaningful, I think that truly meaningful, like to function as a unit of meaning in our mind, there has to be some unity of the multiplicity, and that is the form that unites the many. So yes, there has to be, the forms have to be brought in at the level of what grounds semantic truth, but I think physics is more dealing with the kind of syntactic truth of the laws of nature, what's permissible, what's not permissible, not what these physical variables might be, essentially. Like the semantic question is, what is gravity? That's a metaphysical question. What is the electromagnetic force? What it does, I think, is more the syntactic question, and that's the parallel between that level of physical syntax, so to speak, and the language grounds it, in my mind. And that seems adequate. I'm happy with that. I can kind of move on with my day if I say that's how physics works. And with the kind of pseudo-nominalist, I don't know exactly what you want to call yourself there, but like I just don't really understand how, I don't really understand how it works otherwise. But
yeah, I think you're using syntax perhaps in a way that I don't really use the word. So it makes it a little bit difficult for me to sort of understand, I suppose, what it is that you're asking. But
well, just leaving
what might help.
Sorry, leaving that question aside. I mean, we don't have to deal with syntax anymore. Just the physical theories that work. Why do those theories actually work? It's, to my mind, there has to be a correspondence between the structure of the theory and the structure of the physical world. And if that's not the case, what grounds the usefulness or truth of a physical theory?
Yeah. So, firstly, the first sort of thing I want to do is sort of question this correspondence relation, right? Because I'm sort of unsure what the correspondence relation could in fact consist in. Because we can only ever, I think it's a metaphor, perhaps a useful metaphor, but we can only ever say that one sentence corresponds to another sentence, right? So what do I mean by that? So we might have one sentence given in a physical language, like a particular description of, I don't know, the force. There's a force of, 2 newtons, with this degree or whatever, and so the resultant force is however many degrees I said. Did I say 2 degrees or 20? Cos 20 to whatever, and we end up, we calculate, resolve our vectors, and like this. So this is like a mathematical physics description of what's going on, and then we say, well, what does that correspond to? And we provide another sentence in English, right, where it corresponds to that ball over there falling like that. And so the correspondence is only ever, I mean, again, depending on other philosophical commitments you might have about mind and language, you might say it's only ever between propositions and more propositions, or between ideas and other ideas. Now, obviously, I don't agree to there being propositions in this heavily philosophically, like, theory-laden sense, but I think the correspondence can only ever be between sentences and other sentences. And I don't really, I mean, I understand the way that the metaphor is being used, right? Because it's like, well, I draw a picture of something, and we sort of say, well, it's a good picture just in case it sort of looks like that other thing looks. And so we understand we understand this notion of correspondence by taking that, by using an example like that and creating this kind of metaphor between the one. But the problem is that we're always providing a further description that we compare the statement in physics to, right? A statement in ordinary language, usually about the thing we're purporting to describe. But what we never do is so this is another way of putting it that sometimes helps people. We never stand side on, as it were, between our understanding of reality and our like description and go, oh yeah, like that really corresponds, which is what the correspondence theory is kind of saying happens. Well, that sort of thing never really does happen. Now, okay, so what's the alternative here? I mean, I'm a big fan of something that's called pragmatic realism, right? So we sort of do commit ourselves to there being things out there, reality and a world out there, but it kind of what's really going on sort of reduces down to our human activities and practices and whether they're successful or not. And so we actually do, engage in doing stuff in the world, and if we're successful in our activities, where success really means surviving, right? But I don't think that there's any way, well, at least according to my model of what's going on in reality, that there's any way to survive and have like a systematically false understanding of what's going on. So an accusation that's often kind of levied against the position that I'm holding is something called the evolutionary argument against naturalism by people like Alvin Plantinga. And they'll say, well, look, if something like what you're saying is correct, then, Larry could run away. Larry might have a belief that he really wants to be eaten by tigers, and that's a good thing. Like the best thing is to be eaten by tigers. And he thinks, though, the best way to get eaten by tigers is to run away from them. So you could say he's got like a few false beliefs there. Firstly, that it's like really good to be a good thing for him to be eaten by tigers. That'll help him survive. And secondly, that the way to be eaten by tigers is to run away from them. And then, so the story goes, according to Plantinga, that's an adaptive behavior, but it's actually it includes like false contents or whatever, right? And so the question is, how do you know if your story is correct? That pretty much all of we believe isn't like Larry, right? We're not kind of systematically deceived, but have these useful behaviors. Now, the thing about these kind of stories that people like Plantinga offer is that they can't offer stories that are systematically false and adaptive at the same time. So in the case of Larry, for example, it has to be that the tiger is over there in order for him to run away from it, right? So in order for him to operate on his belief that he's like running away from the tiger, he has to correctly situate himself relative to the tiger. He has to have correct beliefs about the movement of his limbs and joints, and about like where the ground is and what's going to happen if he puts one foot in front of the other, and so on. And so even though there are some false contents in these kind of stories offered by people who offer like an evolutionary argument against naturalism, the kind of naturalism I'm arguing for, it's never the case that what's offered is a systematically false story. And I think this kind of mixed batch of like some true things, some things that turn out to be false, like again, lots of our intuitions about what happened to things at large scales or very small scales, as science seems to tell us, or even about like geometry, for example, like Kant, I think, famously said, what's beyond doubt is that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, right? And that's true on a flat Euclidean plane, but then it turns out, you put it on a curved plane, and you get smaller angles on the concave side and larger angles on the convex side. And so, yeah, it's just that we tend to have a whole bunch of ways of thinking about the world, and some parts of those ways of thinking are true, some are false. Sometimes we're, like what's actually going on is we're compressing a whole bunch of information. It's operationally good to a degree, and there's elements of truth and elements of false. And I think that, my theory here does kind of attach to the way humans are.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what truth is, though, here.
Oh, it's a word. Like, I'm sorry. Yeah, from my view, it's a word. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for them to be true. Okay, I'm still not 100% on how language actually works, when it's effective and when not, if truth is just a word. And it's a very confusing position. I'm sure you deal with that a lot because it's counterintuitive,
It
and
takes a
yet,
long time to, like, I think,
yeah.
get to what I'm offering here.
Can I ask you, like, why you were motivated to take the position? Is it because it was true, or
Yeah, I thought it was correct. Yeah.
but then if truth is just a word, it just seems like such a weird. Like, what drew you into
Well,
the
just is
position,
doing
and
a
then
lot there, right? It's like,
yeah,
like my bank account is just money, right? But if someone stole it all tomorrow, I'd care a lot. Like, truth is just a word, but I care an awful lot about it. You can say, you can put just in front of a lot of things, but the point is that in this sort of social practices, activities, linguistic practices I'm socialized and embedded in, truth is very valuable to me. I care about it a lot. So yeah, it's like, it's a word, but it's a word that I would be willing to sacrifice a lot for, and I'm very concerned about.
yeah, okay. So let's. I don't think I'm going to understand your position on this here. Maybe we could, if you have some time still, we could just touch on, like, what you've dealt with in fine tuning. And
Yeah, sure.
because we said, I know our rapt audience is waiting because we said we would get to that. So, yeah, this is a question that I've thought about quite a bit. I heard part of a discussion that you had about it. So I know there are problems in trying to, like, assess the likelihood of certain settings of the physical constants. Like, what would that mean exactly? I think there is something compelling, though, about the idea that the universe as it exists has created life. That's the fact. Now, the fact that inevitable, was that not, we would have to kind of know metaphysical laws of physics to say whether that was necessarily going to be the case, or how quote unquote likely that would be. Where the probability assessments can become, like, more useful is if you imagine that there are an infinite number of universes with infinite, like, you have the monkeys on the typewriters once again creating the universe, and just pure randomness, an infinite set of pure randomness. You're going to have regions where certain physical laws obtain, and the regions where the laws that lead to life obtain are the ones in which we find ourselves. Of course, that kind of anthropic solution to the fine-tuning argument is one that I've taken seriously. Do you think, but then going further, once you accept that, I think that has a bunch of additional interesting entailments, like if the scope of the universe is that large, I don't think that's completely irrelevant to us, actually. But do you think you have to go there? Do you think that's the anthropic solution works, or what's your assessment there?
So I think in these arguments, it's taken as a datum, right? Something to be explained, that our universe is fine-tuned for life. Now, there are a few things going on, right, in the sentence, our universe is fine-tuned for life. Firstly, what does fine-tuning mean? Fine-tuning means that if we take the entire possibility space for the way things could have been, that a very small number of them contain some particular property. So just in case, a very small number of them have that property, and you're in a world that has that property, then it's a world that's fine-tuned for that property. As Christians who are advocates of fine-tuning, proponents like Luke Barnes will say, it's an unhelpful metaphor, right? Because it can kind of make people think of, like, tuning a dial or whatever, which implies some kind of teleology, and we know about our biases when it comes to teleological explanations and so forth. And it really is bad, it's unhelpful. A lot of people get stuck at that point. Either their biases take over, right? If you're an atheist, you go, fine tuning, I don't like the sound of that. Like, there's no one moving a hand on a dial. And if you're a theist, you go, yeah, fine tuning, like, of course God did it. And you sort of don't even begin to think about the argument because you get stuck on that metaphor. Then we have for life, right? And that's an even stickier wicket, as it were, because often we have so often what physicists will talk about what happens when we vary physical parameters, right? So what are worlds like where physical parameters are different? And again, there's debate to be had amongst physicists and philosophers about what physical parameters can vary. So often you'll find that apologists have very long lists of physical parameters, all of which are assumed are independent of one another. So what that does is it kind of biases the fine-tuning equation, because the more that you have and the more they can vary that are independent of one another, the larger the probability space is going to be. So if you've only got very few that permit life, you're kind of like making the denominator, just to think about it basically, of like how many have life to how many don't. You're making that number on the bottom bigger by including more numbers. And a lot of apologists do that. And there is debate to be had amongst physicists about, what is a legitimate parameter that should be considered in these equations. How are they even independent of one another? So, so it could be the case that actually there's like deeper, as it were, we mean deeper in terms of theory, more fundamental theories from which these numbers kind of get set, and maybe there's only one or two things that vary. I don't know about any of that. I'm kind of happy that my concerns are more philosophical, and I'm happy to let the physicists sort of have this discussion about which parameters can vary. Now, when physicists say the things that they say about life, they have very specific things in mind, right, about life. They mean physical life, by and large, carbon-based life like us. So that does include us with our brains and so forth. And that becomes very important for, again, certain versions of the fine-tuning argument, like that put forward by Robin Collins in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, where the way that you get the likelihood ratio so high of God wanting to create a fine-tuned universe is because we're embodied moral agents, right? And you tell a story about a God who would want to create embodied moral agents. And so obviously that has a high likelihood, according to Collins there. And there's more that can be said about that. But what's meant by physicists is, like carbon-based life as we're kind of familiar with, like eukaryotic life, like single-celled organisms, even, that would be a life-permitting universe if it contained that. But this kind of assumes that a problem with this is that it's an essentialist characterization, right, of what life means, which, however you interpret it, is going to entail certain things which might be inconvenient for the fine-tuning argument later down the line. Either you're going to have to concede a broader conception of life, which includes disembodied minds, right? Like God, for example, if God's going to be an explanation of anything, or angels and demons, if you're going to go with a particular theology, or even disembodied minds as life forms, if you're going to go with humans as being, fundamentally disembodied minds. So that's one thing that could be a kind of problem. But the thing is that once you kind of open up the possibility space for all these things, then there's a large number of ways that God could have in fact created a world that was life permitting, right? So the way that you get the incredibly unlikely number of our universe being fine-tuned is because there's an incredibly small number of ways that the physical constants can be to permit life like us with brains and physical structures. But if we're not wholly grounded in those physical structures, if we're disembodied souls, and if God could have achieved his goals to create moral agents by just having a universe with like souled beings or something like that, well, then the physical constants can actually be any which way, and God could have still achieved his goals. And so that kind of that changes the likelihood ratio of a life-permitting universe given theism. And then there are various kind of other things that you can say about that. So you can, there are responses that could be said about, well, I'm restricting the probability space in this very specific kind of way, and maybe that's going to, in fact, actually rule out God as an explanation. I basically what I did in my dissertation, if I find the point where I actually offered the argument, is I just fleshed out essentially all of the available avenues that you could go down with this, and explained why each of them includes some kind of problem for theism. So the argument was, either it's certain that life is wholly grounded in physical states, or it's not certain. So that's just a kind of tautologist logical truth, right? And the reason it's framed in terms of certainty is because these arguments are given in Bayesian form. So a proposition that's certain has a probability of 1, and a proposition that's not certain has, somewhere between 0 and 0.9 recurring or whatever, which, well, that's 1. So it's going to be lower than that. So, and then the second premise is, if it's certain that life is wholly grounded in physical states, then this either rules out God as an explanation of fine-tuning for life, or the posterior probability of theism, conditional on fine-tuning, is not much greater than the posterior probability of atheism, conditional on fine-tuning. So both of those would be problems for fine-tuning proponents, right, who want to say that actually theism comes out on top. However, if it's not certain that life is wholly grounded in physical states, and I think this is the more plausible horn, because I don't think we really have a good understanding of what life is and what's possible and what isn't, then it is not true that our universe is finely tuned for life. And so either God is not an explanation of fine-tuning, or the posterior probability of theism, conditional on fine-tuning, is not much greater than the posterior probability of atheism, conditional on fine-tuning, or our universe is not finely tuned for life. If any of these disjuncts is correct, then fine-tuning arguments are unsound. Therefore, fine-tuning arguments are unsound. Right? And then I go on to argue for each of the various parts of that argument. I suppose the most controversial of which will be those conditionals about what follows from taking life to be wholly grounded in physical states or not. But I think I think the considerations that I have are relatively solid, especially given that we're talking about these epistemic possibility spaces. So as soon as the epistemic possibility space opens up, which is one of those disjuncts in the first premise, then you basically get any kind of conceivable thing being possible, which enables me to do whatever to make theism bad. And as soon as it's certain, right, epistemically certain, then it's certain what will happen, and so the things that follow from that are fairly clear cut. Yeah. So
maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but like if mind is potentially independent of physical states, how could that possibly support the atheist position? Like, aren't you like you're contradicting reductive physicalism there? So it would have to be an atheist who's not a reductive physicalist.
So firstly, we're talking about epistemic possibility here, right? So there are different types of possibility that philosophers will talk about and will argue about the existence of. So epistemic possibility is the broadest one, the broadest sense of possibility, insofar as when we're talking about epistemic possibility, we're basically talking about whatever is conceivable and doesn't entail a contradiction, right? Now, you might say, I don't know, maybe this is where the contentious part is, right? Maybe you'd say logical possibility is broader, because logical possibility is anything that just doesn't contain a contradiction. But some people will say, well, actually, I can kind of conceive of like a square circle or a square triangle or something, which is a contradiction, but maybe that's something conceivable and thus epistemically possible. And that's where, like, it gets unclear and where philosophers have debates. But when we're talking about epistemic possibility, we're talking about something very broad. Now, another sense of possibility, another couple of senses of possibility are firstly physical possibility. So physical possibility, as the name implies, is just about what's physically possible, right? So it's physically possible for me to travel to the moon, but it's physically impossible for me to jump under the power of my legs to the moon right now, like given the gravitational forces acting on me and the amount of ATP in my legs and so forth. Metaphysical possibility is a little bit broader, because metaphysical possibility could be about could include things that are not physically possible. I mean, on my view, they're the same, but for some people's views, metaphysical possibility includes things that are not physically possible. So I might say, okay, it's metaphysically impossible that God exists, right? Because I'm a naturalist, so I cash out metaphysical possibility in terms of my naturalism. But when it comes to epistemic possibility, it's epistemically possible that God exists, because, like that there's some non-zero credence that I have as an agent towards God's existence. There's various ways of thinking about things that make it plausible. I recognize that there are coherent systems of thought about theism that I happen to disagree with. I give them much less of a credence than I give to naturalism, which is why I'm a naturalist, right? And I think it's metaphysically impossible that God exists, but I still think it's epistemically possible, because these are different types of possibility that we're talking about. So when I'm talking about the epistemic possibility of there being disembodied minds, in an argument that's the fine-tuning argument is about epistemic possibility, well, then I'm kind of permitted to do that even if I don't believe in the things that are in the epistemic possibility space.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds like a very technical argument that I'm probably not, again, going to fully grasp, but it's interesting nonetheless. So the way I've thought about this is more in terms of like the scope of the cosmos, and I was totally satisfied by an anthropic solution here. There is, the quest, if you don't want to admit a multiverse, I think there is a problem with fine-tuning, however you want to phrase it, in that, somehow reality is so configured as to lead to life. And if this is like the one and only Big Bang event, that's it. That's, all of reality. It seems intuitively that some explanation should be given for why the universe is such as to lead to life. If any random set of physical constants is spit out, of course life is going to exist. That's explanation enough for my purposes, the anthropic one. But if you don't want to do that, then what recourse would you have? Doesn't it seem like some explanation should be required for like the reality is constituted in this way and it gives rise to us? Why? And also, does it give rise to us contingently or necessarily? And that's an interesting question. I don't know how you would even resolve that, in physics perspective.
I think that my objection in my dissertation, the direction that it's going really is to say that you're kind of expecting an answer to a malformed question, right? Because you're assuming that the universe is fine-tuned for life, and that assumes some things that either undercuts your need for an explanation or to ask a question in the first place. So it's sort of like, it's kind of like asking, what's north of the North Pole or something, right? Where or what's the best? If I just say what's the best, that has the form of a question, right? But when we think about it, there's nothing. It doesn't actually make any sense in the first case, because it doesn't make sense to ask what's north of the North Pole, because that's the northernmost point. So you're asking for like something that you're just asking a malformed question. In the second case of what's the best, well, you need like a context, right, for something to be bad. You need, well, what's the best football player? What's the best computer for me to buy, right? And then we're talking about how much money have I got available, or what are my needs and desires. But just asking what's the best absent any context doesn't make any sense. And that's the sort of thing that I'm getting at in my objection to the fine-tuning argument for life, right? Where I'm saying, in fact, that our universe is not fine-tuned for life, because what's meant by life actually encompasses a possibility space such that any way that the universe could be physically could be a life-permitting universe epistemically. So just in case some form of and this draws on Nielsen Barbu's work in a paper called Electrons in Love. So he puts it rather poetically, where he tells a story about worlds where the psychophysical laws are such that protons pulling electrons into their orbits or whatever, it causes the psychic states of falling in love and soul building and stuff like that, right? And in worlds with sufficiently friendly that you can tell a story that doesn't involve contradictions about any physical combination of the laws, such that that world is one that's like a soul building world, or one that's one that allows the things that we say it would be valuable for God to create, right? And so when we say that the universe is fine-tuned for life, often in these fine-tuning arguments, we're saying of all these worlds that could be physically, a very small number of them are life-permitting, right? In the sense that a very small number of them include conscious moral agents like ourselves. because that's why God wants to create a world like ours. That's why it has a high likelihood under theism. Now, what I'm saying is actually all of the worlds in that physical possibility space, in fact, are life permitting, right? If when life is taken in the relevant sense of epistemic possibility to include disembodied minds and basically everything that it's within God's power, God on a classical model of theism where his powers aren't limited and so forth, that it's within God's powers to do. And so it's no longer the case then that the world is in fact fine-tuned for life. And so there's nothing to explain when we ask the question, why is the universe fine-tuned for life? It's like asking, well, why is my name Timmy? Well, my name isn't Timmy, right? So there's no like explanation needed.
Okay. I mean, you could obviously respond that when we say that the universe is fine-tuned for life, we mean that this universe is fine-tuned to produce self-replicating molecules, right? And other configurations of like the gravitational constant or the nuclear weak force or whatever would not, like particles wouldn't hold together. You wouldn't even have molecules in many settings, perhaps most. And the gravitational constant, especially, like you wouldn't have a planet orbiting a star where you would have this kind of Goldilocks zone where you can get complex chemical interactions. So, I mean, what if the theist responds, and I'm a Platonist, just to like lay my cards on the table, and you could probably call me a theist. I do believe in God effectively, but not, more in a Platonist sense than a typical Christian one. Yeah, so what do you say to the theist who responds in that way? I mean, the basic argument might be that we don't have an explanation why the gravitational constant is what it is. And in light of that, we see that this setting of the gravitational constant does allow for biological life. And so one possible reason, which is better than the absence of a reason, one reason for this particular setting is that it allows for life. So in that kind of limited context, not considering epistemic possibility broadly, but just like, biological life with self-replicating molecules and the physical constants.
So whether we frame the argument in terms of, like Bayesian epistemic possibilities or inference is the best explanation or whatever, what we're doing is comparing explanations. And I sort of think the formalism of Bayesianism is sort of, not required. It can help amongst people who aren't trying to do harmful things. It can be a weapon for people who are trying to do malicious things to try and pull the wool over people's eyes, and I don't like that. So yeah, the question that we have to ask then is, so suppose it is a fact, right, that our universe is fine-tuned for biological life, and that adjective biological, it is doing a lot, I agree, to, and this is one of the avenues I talk about in my paper, this as a potential response. But the problem is that biological life, that adjective, that has to be a subset of life, right? Because it can't be greater than the set of life. So that's going to do all sorts of things. That changes other commitments that we might take. But here's a question. Here's what we have to think of when we're postulating theism as an explanation. Why does God want biological life, right? And I think that becomes a very hard question to answer without doing certain things. So I think all things being equal, presumably God desires biological life, right? Just as much. He at least desires biological life less than he desires, right, all kinds of life, because biological life is a subset of life. But we have to ask sort of questions like, well, why does God have any of these desires at all? That's got to be in the possibility space. A God who doesn't have desires because they're self-satisfied. A God who desires for a universe that doesn't contain life and patterns and things like that. Now, there are ways that theists get around this, basically by telling theological stories about God's desires and what he wants and what he's like, right? So maybe he'll say, well, God's Trinitarian, and the Trinitarian nature is loving, and stuff like that. But then what you're doing is you're specifying your hypothesis, so in such a way that you make the prior significantly smaller. So if your hypothesis is like this Trinitarian God with this specific theology explains it, well, for each new way that you specify your hypothesis, you're like minimizing the prior that you're putting into that fine-tuning explanation. So suppose that you think so theism is going to be the biggest, right, the biggest possibility space for the explanation, and theism is going to have the biggest overlap with worlds that are fine-tuned. Because what we're thinking about is what's the probability of theism conditional on that we're in the space of fine-tuned worlds, how much of that includes theistic explanations, right? The biggest overlap between those two sets is bare theism. But then as soon as you start like specifying all of these things about what God's like, God's desires, your theology, in order to get the kind of world that you like, where a God desires, because I think and I think Christians will disagree, but I mean, my view is that the reason that they'll disagree is because they're committed to an alternative theology, right? But you have to put that on the shelf and go, but what is in the possibility space? You have to forget what do I believe, but just think what's in the possibility space of what God could do. And if you believe, like for example, in that possibility space, you've got an omnipotent God. Well, one classical understanding of God's omnipotence is the capacity to perform any action that doesn't involve a contradiction, for example. Now, there's debate and different definitions, but suppose you go with something like that. Well, then presumably God could do anything that doesn't involve a contradiction. So now the possibility space is divided up into literally every single possible decision, and just one of those is creating a world with biological life. And if you specify the hypothesis even more to say, like it's Trinitarian, it's going to be an even smaller chunk. So now you've got like, well, God's Trinitarian, and if you specify it to say, and one of the persons is Jesus or something, like now it's an even smaller space. And so actually the problem is that you end up with just this really, really small prior, if you go down this route, I think.
Yes, but still they could at least say that's why the gravitational constant is what it is. And if you don't have another explanation, don't they win out?
No, because I can do this with shy intuitive fairies, right? I can say that there are shy intuitive fairies with just the right desires and causal powers to give me whatever I want. But the reason that shy intuitive fairies are a bad explanation is because it has such a small prior probability because of all the things that I've baked in to my shy intuitive fairies. I think if there's debates, right, about how we should consider priors, but I think if we consider like a pure state of ignorance, then in a pure state of ignorance, theism and shy intuitive fairy or fairies, we might say, should be like on an equal playing field, or perhaps that we could disagree about that as well. But then as we look at the likelihood ratio, the likelihood is just how much of the possibility space of this explanation contains the thing it's trying to explain, right? And the problem with likelihoods is that you can basically come up with anything as long as it makes it really likely that you have that thing. So you might say, well, there are noises coming from the other room, right? Well, there being noises in the other room has a really high likelihood, given that there are goblins having a battle in there, right? Because that pretty much entails, that's like 100% of the likelihood ratio that there are noises coming from that room if there are goblins having a battle in there.
Yeah, sure. But so if you and I are in this room and we hear, and you say there are goblins over there, and I don't have a better explanation, I'm going to go with yours until I come up with a better explanation.
Well, I mean, if it were true that genuinely was all you knew, right, in terms of an explanation, possibly that is what you go with. But I don't think that that's right, because the reason that you wouldn't go with the goblins is because I think the way that you'd be thinking about it is, yeah, but there's like wind or like a running tap, and the prior probability of goblins, given everything else I know, right, because we have to include all of our background knowledge as well, is so low. It is so low compared to like running taps, wind, rats, mice, burglars, all of these things that not only do they happen all the time, but they also have a really high likelihood rate likelihood ratio if they're true.
So once I come up with any of those other explanations, I would probably go with them because of the prior probability. So I agree with that. That's fine. But in the absence of another explanation, so going back to
but that isn't the case in fine-tuning, that we're absent any other explanation, right?
So with the gravitational, what's just the simple answer to this question besides fine-tuning? Why is the gravitational constant what it is?
So one answer is it's metaphysically necessary. I mean, that would be what I genuinely believe. But
I'd be curious to hear why you think it would be.
Okay. So imagine, I mean, I don't know about your particular branch of theism, right? Imagine I asked you the question, why does God exist? How do you think you would answer that? Because that has the form of a why question, right?
Right. Yeah. I would say that there's, before any more complex structure, necessarily there is simplicity. And so for anything else to be, there must be the one.
So it's a type of metaphysical necessity, right? Why,
yes.
When we ask the question why, and that's the same thing that I'm basically appealing to, right? I'm just saying it's metaphysically necessary that it be that value.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm more, not all theistic explanations or concepts of God will have a similar, the aseity or self-subsistence necessity of God will not be equally justified in different systems. I think in classical theism, it does a better job than personalistic theism. And I think Platonism does the best job of all of them, because I think in any conceivable thought experiment, there is no possibility of complexity without a simplicity that it relies on. So it's like the impossibility of thinking away the one that gives it that really strong force. Whereas the gravitational constant doesn't have that same advantage, because we can run simulations, inadequate simulations though, of universes where we put in other values for the constant. So then that would mean it's it doesn't have that a priori metaphysically necessary force, because we can imagine the contrary. But
that's not how I think metaphysical necessity works, though. I don't think that metaphysical necessity is to do with conceivability. I think conceivability is to do with epistemic possibility. And as I've said, I think God's existence, I think the various constants being different values, is epistemically possible. But one explanation, because remember, the question is, what's an alternative candidate explanation? And an alternative candidate explanation is that it's metaphysically necessary.
Then what?
Or should I intuitive fairies, or I could say there's a mysterious natural disposition to generate universes with. I mean, these are all candidate explanations that we can go with.
I think, your best bet is the anthropic argument, in my opinion, as the arguing against the theistic position. That's why I was a Christian up until on and off up until I was 21, and then I looked at fine-tuning, and I thought the many roles interpretation was also neat. I like the multiverse idea, and I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. And that's I don't think it was a good reason to abandon Christianity at that time. It wasn't a warranted change, but that's what really pushed me over the edge. Because otherwise, we would need to look at this issue of metaphysical necessity. But that's obviously opening a big can of worms, and I've taken up too much of your time already, which I do appreciate. So I'll leave the option to you. If you want to just give some basic account then of that, maybe one more time. It's a helpful scheme: the epistemic necessity, metaphysical necessity, physical necessity, and then we can wrap up and hopefully talk again in the future. You seem like an interesting guy, very intelligent.
So in terms of philosophers talk about different types of possibility. Broadly, there's all sorts really. People talk about logical, epistemic, metaphysical, physical, gnomic, which is keeping the laws the same. Nomos being the Greek for laws. So basically, when people talk about possibility and the notion of necessity and contingency are very closely connected, right? So something is necessary in one of those senses of possibility, just in case it takes up like 100% of the possibility space, right? So if I say something is metaphysically necessary, that means it takes up 100% of the metaphysical possibility space. If I say something is epistemically necessary, then I'm saying that it takes up 100% of the epistemic possibility space. So that means that it's actually certain, right? It's beyond any doubt whatsoever.
How would you determine metaphysical possibility space? Like,
well, I mean, honest answer, you just make it up. But I mean, philosophers have well-defined criteria. I think that the rules are basically defined by playing the game of philosophy, right? It's what will other philosophers let you get away with. That's my view of what metaphysical possibility is, really. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny because you still like remind me of Peterson in a certain way. Like Peterson is a very hardcore pragmatist. In the discussion with Sam Harris about like the nature of truth or whatnot, like he really was saying like anything that's useful for propagating life is going to be true in some sense, which I don't know if I would go that far.
That's not quite my view. Yeah.
No, I didn't get that sense either, but there is something similar in that, like at the end of the day, it's
position. Yeah.
Yeah. And those positions are interesting, and I've identified as a pragmatist in certain senses. I mean, epistemologically, I think I still am. Even Plato, you could almost say he had a kind of pragmatist background because he always treats his doctrines hypothetically. And so, like, it's what, at the end of the day, you can always kind of back out of any particular commitment, and you are faced with, like, real situations that have to be negotiated, and, like, there's almost a deeper level of reality to that than any particular belief. And so pragmatism does have a prima facie appeal to it, and maybe as an American, I sympathize with, like, the American pragmatists just by blood affinity. I don't know if that's the reason, but in any case, it's been very good talking with you, Nathan. It'd be nice to talk again in the future more about, I guess, God and maybe some metaphysics and stuff like that. Good luck with your entry into the workforce. Have you found a job already, or are you still looking?
I'm doing endless code interviews at the moment, so there we go. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Wishing you luck on that. So, again, thanks guys for listening. Take care.